Tonight, we're stepping into a story most people have never heard, because it doesn't end the way Pompeii stories usually do. This one isn't about who died, it's about a boy who got away. His name was Avianius Felicio, and his story went untold for nearly 2,000 years. Pieced together only recently from two forgotten stone records, one from the city he fled, one from the town that took him in. If you're enjoying these true stories from history, hit subscribe and drop a comment telling me where you're listening from tonight. Now, as we step quietly into the Bay of Naples, 79 AD, let your body sink into stillness. Let your breathing slow. You don't need to do anything now. Just listen and drift gently back into the past. Everyone knows how the Pompeii story is supposed to end. The volcano erupts, the ash falls, and an entire city disappears in a single catastrophic day. Its people frozen exactly where they stood. It's the version told in documentaries, textbooks, even television shows. Total annihilation, no survivors, a city that simply ceased to exist. For centuries, that was largely the accepted story, reinforced by the haunting plaster casts of bodies found frozen in their final positions. The kind of images that understandably dominate how most people picture Pompeii's final hours. It made for a powerful, tragic narrative. It also happened to be incomplete. Pompeii, before the eruption, was home to thousands of people. A bustling commercial city with markets, temples, bathhouses, and busy streets. The eruption of Mount Vesuvius, when it came on that August day in 79 AD, was catastrophic by any measure, burying the city under layers of ash and pumice that would preserve it, essentially untouched, for the better part of 2,000 years. But recent archaeological work, patient research into scattered Roman records across the wider region, has revealed something the popular narrative largely left out. A significant number of Pompeii's residents survived. Not everyone stayed. Not everyone died. Many fled in the hours before the worst of the eruption arrived, carrying whatever they could, running toward towns and villages that hadn't yet felt the mountain's fury. Piecing this story together required a very particular kind of historical detective work, cross-referencing names found in Pompeii's business records, loan documents, property deeds, with the same names appearing afterward in nearby towns. New tombstones, new business dealings, new lives quietly rebuilt in unfamiliar places. It's a bit like trying to trace a family's history today using nothing but scattered receipts and old address changes, except spread across an empire and separated by 2,000 years of history in between. Among the names historians eventually trace through this patient, careful work was a teenage boy from a family that had once known better days. A family whose story, once pieced back together, reveals exactly how ordinary people managed to survive an extraordinary catastrophe. The Aviani family hadn't always struggled. Records suggest they'd once held real standing within Pompeii, the kind of family whose name meant something in a city where social rank shaped nearly every aspect of daily life. By the time young Avianius was growing up, though, that standing had noticeably eroded. The clearest evidence of exactly how far the family's fortunes had fallen comes from an unlikely source, a loan document, the kind of routine financial record Romans kept meticulously, witnessed and signed by a specific order reflecting each witness's social rank. On this particular document, dated shortly before the eruption, a member of the Aviani family appears among the witnesses, his signature positioned just above those of enslaved witnesses at the very bottom of the list. For a family that had once ranked considerably higher in Pompeii's social order, that placement tells its own quiet, uncomfortable story. Growing up inside a family experiencing this kind of decline shapes a person in particular ways. Avianius likely understood, from a young age, the gap between his family's remembered status and their present, more precarious circumstances, old family pride perhaps colliding uncomfortably with daily practical struggle. It's not so different in its emotional shape from any modern family navigating a significant, humbling change in fortune, memory of better days sitting uneasily alongside the reality of present hardship. What historians don't know, and likely never will, are the smaller details of his daily life, his personality, his friendships, the ordinary texture of being a teenager in Pompeii's streets and markets. What survives instead is simply his name, appearing in a financial record that happened to be preserved by the very disaster that would soon upend everything his family had left. By the summer of 79 AD, Avianius was coming of age in a city that, for all its familiar rhythms, market days, religious festivals, the busy commerce of a Roman coastal town, sat directly in the shadow of a mountain nobody in Pompeii had any reason to consider dangerous. Vesuvius had been quiet for so long that it barely registered as a mountain with any history of violence at all. Simply part of the landscape, green and unremarkable, the way a familiar hill might be to anyone who's lived beneath one their entire life. Whatever ordinary concerns filled Avianius's days that summer, family finances, the small dramas of adolescence, the routine business of simply growing up, none of it could have prepared him for what was about to arrive from the mountain that had always, until this point, simply been part of the view. The 24th of August began, by every indication, as an entirely ordinary late summer day. The heat settled over Pompeii's streets the way it always did this time of year. Merchants opened their shops. The business of daily life continued exactly as it had the day before, and the day before that. Early in the afternoon, something changed. A sound, distant but unmistakable, rolled across the city, followed by a sight that would have stopped anyone in their tracks. Mount Vesuvius, the quiet, familiar mountain that had shaped Pompeii's skyline for as long as anyone could remember, was no longer quiet. A massive column of ash and debris began climbing into the sky above it, rising with a speed and scale that defied anything in anyone's experience. For Avianius, wherever he was in the city at that moment, market, workshop, home, this sight would have arrived with the same confused, disorienting shock it brought everyone else in Pompeii. There was no framework yet for understanding what a volcanic eruption actually meant, no historical memory of Vesuvius ever behaving this way, nothing to draw on except the simple, overwhelming evidence of his own eyes. Ash began falling not long after, fine at first, then increasingly heavy, dusting rooftops and streets with a pale layer that thickened steadily as the afternoon wore on. Pumice stones, light but accumulating rapidly, began littering the ground, making walking increasingly difficult. Streets slowly filling with debris that hadn't existed hours earlier. Families throughout Pompeii faced the same impossible, rapidly narrowing decision in these early hours. Stay and hope the worst had already passed, sheltering indoors as ash continued falling. Or leave, gathering whatever could be carried quickly, and attempt to outrun a danger nobody could accurately measure or predict. For families like the Aviani, already navigating diminished circumstances, this decision carried its own particular weight. Fewer resources meant fewer options. Less certainty about where safety might actually be found. Less margin for error if the choice made turned out to be wrong. Whatever conversation happened inside their home that afternoon, whatever fear, uncertainty, and rapid calculation went into it, the outcome would determine everything that followed. By evening, as the ash continued falling and the ground began trembling with increasing frequency, the Aviani family, along with countless others throughout Pompeii, faced a decision that could no longer be delayed. Whatever they chose next would decide whether they lived to see the following morning at all. The Aviani family chose to run. Whatever specific moment finally tipped the decision, a particularly strong tremor, a neighbor's panicked warning, simple accumulating dread, they made the choice that would ultimately save their lives, gathering whatever they could carry and joining the growing stream of Pompeii's residents moving toward the city's gates. Leaving wasn't simple. The streets themselves had become genuinely hazardous, ash and pumice accumulating thickly enough to make walking difficult. Visibility reduced by the ash still falling steadily from the darkened sky above. Crowds moved together through this chaos, families calling out for each other. The ordinary order of city life completely unraveling in real time. For a teenager like Avianius, this journey would have meant navigating genuine physical danger alongside the less visible but equally real burden of watching his parents and family manage fear and decision-making under the worst possible circumstances. Adolescence rarely prepares anyone for genuine catastrophe. Yet catastrophe, when it arrives, doesn't wait for convenient timing. The direction of escape mattered enormously. Some fled toward the coast, hoping for rescue by sea, a route that would prove fatal for many given how quickly conditions along the shoreline deteriorated as the eruption intensified. Others moved inland, away from the immediate coastal danger, towards smaller towns and communities that hadn't yet felt Vesuvius's full fury. The Aviani family's path led them toward Nuteria, a smaller, less prominent town roughly 10 miles from Pompeii. Far enough away to eventually offer genuine safety, close enough to reach on foot if the journey began early enough and moved quickly enough. 10 miles sounds manageable under ordinary circumstances. Under these circumstances, ash falling, ground trembling, visibility reduced, panic spreading through every street and road, it would have felt considerably longer, each mile demanding endurance nobody in the family had ever needed to summon before. It's worth sitting with what this journey actually required. Not dramatic heroics, but simple, exhausting persistence. One difficult step after another, away from everything familiar, toward an uncertain destination that offered nothing more concrete than distance from the immediate danger behind them. Whether they knew, setting out, that they'd made the right choice, or whether uncertainty accompanied every single step of that difficult journey, the historical record can't say with any certainty. What it can say is that they made it. The road to Nuceria, under ordinary circumstances, was simply a road, unremarkable, traveled regularly by merchants, farmers, and travelers moving between the two communities. On this particular day, it became something else entirely. A lifeline crowded with terrified people all making the same desperate calculation the Aviani family had made. Ash continued falling throughout the journey, thick enough by this point to make breathing genuinely difficult for extended periods, forcing many travelers to cover their faces with whatever cloth they had available. The Aviani family, moving alongside neighbors and strangers alike, would have shared this same struggle. Every mile marked by discomfort that, under any other circumstances, might have felt unbearable, yet paled entirely next to what remained behind them. Darkness arrived unnaturally early that day, the ash cloud from Vesuvius blocking enough sunlight that Pompeii's final hours unfolded in something resembling deep twilight. Hours before actual evening should have arrived. For those still traveling the road toward Nuceria, this premature darkness added genuine disorientation to an already harrowing journey, familiar landmarks obscured, the simple act of staying on the correct path becoming its own quiet challenge. Other families made this same journey alongside the Aviani. Some names historians have since traced through the same patient archival work. The Adali, the Missouri, entire households uprooted in a single terrifying day, all moving in the same general direction, toward whatever safety distance and unfamiliar towns might offer. There's something worth noting in this collective movement. Strangers and neighbors alike bound together by shared, immediate danger, whatever ordinary social distinctions existed between them rendered meaningless by the simple, urgent need to survive. Tremors continued throughout the journey, the ground shifting unpredictably beneath already exhausted travelers, adding physical difficulty to a journey already testing everyone's endurance. Children would have needed carrying, elderly family members would have struggled to maintain pace. Every family group facing its own particular version of the same brutal calculation. How much can we carry? How fast can we move? How much longer can we keep going? By the time exhausted travelers began reaching Nuceria's outskirts, hours after fleeing Pompeii, they arrived not as visitors, but as refugees, carrying essentially nothing beyond what they'd managed to grab in those first chaotic moments. Their entire previous life reduced to whatever fit in their arms during a desperate escape from a city that, behind them, was still being buried beneath the mountain's continuing fury. Arriving safely in Nuceria solved one problem while immediately creating several others. The Aviani family, along with countless other refugees, now faced the considerable challenge of rebuilding an entire life in an unfamiliar town, with limited resources, no established connections, and the fresh, unprocessed trauma of everything they'd just survived. It's here that the historical record grows quieter regarding Avianius's immediate family, and considerably more specific about what happened to him individually. According to a tombstone that survived the centuries, Avianius was eventually taken in by a family named Masuri, recorded formally as their foster son. This detail carries more historical weight than it might initially seem to. Foster arrangements, historians studying Roman Pompeii have noted, simply don't appear anywhere in the archaeological record from the city's roughly 160 years of documented history before the eruption. Extended biological family typically absorbed orphaned children, aunts, uncles, grandparents, rather than formal fostering by unrelated families. The fact that Avianius specifically required this kind of arrangement strongly suggests something difficult, that whatever family members had begun that desperate journey from Pompeii with him, he arrived in Nuceria without any of them surviving to continue caring for him. It's worth sitting with the weight of that detail for a moment. A teenager, already navigating his family's diminished social standing, already forced to flee everything familiar in a single terrifying day. Arriving in an unfamiliar town having apparently lost the very family members who'd fled alongside him. Now dependent entirely on the willingness of strangers to take him in. The Masuri family's decision to formally foster him says something meaningful about the community's refugees, like Avianius, found themselves rebuilt within. These weren't wealthy benefactors extending charity from a position of comfortable security. The Masuri, like Avianius's own family, were themselves refugees, themselves navigating limited resources and an unfamiliar new home. Their choice to take in an orphaned boy, formally enough that it was later recorded on his own tombstone, reflects a particular kind of generosity. People with genuinely little still finding room to care for someone with even less. It's not so different, in its essential shape, from how communities today often respond most generously during genuine crises. Not the wealthy, acting from comfortable distance, but people who've experienced hardship themselves, recognizing and responding to hardship in others. Understanding, in a way privilege rarely teaches, exactly what that particular kind of loss actually requires. Avianius Felicio, the surname eventually attached to his name meaning, fittingly, fortunate or lucky, grew up in Nuceria as part of this new, unconventional family, his Pompeii childhood. His biological family, his entire previous life reduced to fragments, carried forward only in the family name that survived alongside him. For nearly 2,000 years, Avianius Felicio's story remained exactly where it had settled, scattered across two separate pieces of stone in two different locations, unconnected, unread as any kind of continuous narrative, simply waiting. The lone document from Pompeii sat among thousands of similarly mundane Roman financial records, the kind of everyday paperwork historians catalog meticulously but rarely find individually remarkable. The tombstone from Nuceria sat among countless other Roman grave markers, its inscription recording a foster relationship that, without additional context, revealed little beyond the bare fact of its existence. It took the patient, deliberate work of modern historians, cross-referencing names across thousands of scattered records, to recognize that these two separate pieces of evidence told a single continuous story. A boy present in Pompeii before the eruption. A boy formerly fostered by a new family, present in Nuceria afterward. Connect those two facts carefully enough, and an entire hidden narrative of survival and rebuilding emerges from what initially looked like two unrelated, unremarkable records. This kind of historical detective work rarely receives the attention dramatic archaeological discoveries do. No golden treasure, no perfectly preserved body, simply careful, methodical research connecting scattered dots across centuries of surviving documentation. Yet what it reveals feels, in its own quiet way, just as significant as any more dramatic discovery. Proof that Pompeii's story was never simply one of total, indiscriminate destruction. Avianius represents just one thread within a considerably larger, more complex pattern historians have begun uncovering. Family after family who fled, rebuilt, and continued their lives in towns throughout the region. Their stories surviving not in dramatic final moments frozen in ash, but in the quieter, more ordinary records of daily life continuing afterward. Business dealings, tombstones, the mundane paperwork of people simply getting on with living. It's a fundamentally different way of understanding what happened at Pompeii. Less a single moment of complete annihilation, and more a complex human story of catastrophe, loss, and remarkable, quiet resilience, the kind that rarely makes it into popular retellings, yet arguably deserves remembering just as much as anything preserved in ash. Sitting with Avianius's story now, it's worth considering why the survival narrative took so much longer to surface than the story of destruction. Why plaster casts of the dead became Pompeii's defining image, while stories like this one waited nearly 2,000 years to be properly told. Perhaps destruction simply makes for a more immediately powerful story. Dramatic, complete, easily grasped in a single haunting image. Survival, by comparison, is messier, scattered across mundane paperwork and quiet tombstones, requiring patient work to properly assemble, offering no single dramatic moment to anchor an entire narrative around. Yet there's something genuinely important in remembering that catastrophe, however overwhelming, rarely tells only one story. For every dramatic image of sudden loss, there were families like the Aviani, making difficult choices under impossible pressure, walking exhausting miles away from everything familiar, arriving somewhere new with nothing, and somehow, gradually, rebuilding lives worth living. Avianius's own story carries a particular quiet poignancy, a boy who lost seemingly everything, his home, his city, likely his immediate family, and who found, in the generosity of another family with little to spare, something resembling a second chance. His name, Fortunate, feels almost too perfectly chosen for a life that began in such devastating loss and continued against considerable odds into whatever ordinary, unremarkable years followed in Nuceria. Perhaps that's the truest lesson sitting beneath this particular story. That survival itself, however unglamorous, however absent from dramatic popular retellings, remains its own quiet form of triumph. Not every important story ends in tragedy. Some simply continue, quietly, unremarkably, in towns 10 miles away, in tombstones waiting patiently for someone to finally connect them to the story they'd been telling all along. And with that, tonight's journey through the quiet, remarkable story of Avianius Felicio comes to its close. Wherever you're listening from, whatever weight your own day carried, there's no road left to walk tonight, no danger to outrun. Just rest, safe and unhurried, exactly where you already are. Sleep now. Tonight, there's nothing left but that.